These days, anytime I see gritty realism or morally gray, I instantly assume the campaign or setting fucking sucks.
Stop saying shit like that. It's unprofessional.
Oh, is that what I'm going for here?
Just want you to stop saying odd shit.
Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, but I want to be clear up front. In the hands of a skilled DM, gritty realism and gray morality can enhance a tabletop game. When done well, gritty realism adds tension that you might not get out of a normal campaign, making every decision and resource matter, while gray morality creates nuanced, layered characters and dilemmas that challenge the players to think critically about their choices. These elements can deepen engagement and make victories hard-earned and failures much more meaningful. The problem is, the vast majority of hobbyists aren't using it to their full potential, and there's this pretentious thought that games that employ these methods are more complex or mature because ambiguity in their mind equals depth. This is not the case, and quite frankly, I'd say that in many ways, ambiguous and morally gray games are much simpler than games with clear moral absolutes. What I've found is that most dungeon masters will turn these two concepts into everything. Instead of just this campaign or this area of the map, the entire world is gritty realism. Instead of just a few important characters or, maybe even like a faction, every person in the world is morally gray. At this point, nothing matters, and this is going to seem like I'm beating a dead horse, but I genuinely feel like Game of Thrones is a huge part of why. In the wake of its release, there's been a huge overemphasis on gray morality especially. And I could be wrong, but from what I've seen, there's also been a surge of campaigns, particularly advertising political intrigue, gray morality, and gritty realism, with many of them making mention of Game of Thrones as a sort of comparison point. Now, people are obviously influenced by the medias that they enjoy, so it comes as no surprise that a huge hit in pop culture was going to make its way into the tabletop hobby, but the influence it has had, in my opinion, has been largely negative. So, let's talk about why these two concepts suck, or rather, why the way that they've been used sucks, starting with gray morality. If as a dungeon master, you make every faction, every villain, and every NPC some morally gray character, you're not being clever. You're being evasive because you can't commit to meaningful moral consequences. I find that dungeon masters that think this way constantly want their players to second guess themselves because they believe that moral complexity equals narrative brilliance. But the reality is that all you're doing is draining the tension from the game. A game without clear enemies, without any satisfying resolutions, and a whole lot of "it's complicated" is gonna flounder. The idea that I've come to is honestly that gray morality is just a safety net. The dungeon master might think that they're crafting a deep experience, but what they're really doing is making every decision a no-win scenario, where the players are often punished regardless of what choice they make. It's not thought-provoking, it is paralyzing. When you strip away the distinction between good and evil, you rob the players of the satisfaction that comes from actually standing for something. Often, I've seen that when players actually embrace moral absolutes and strive to stand for something, whether that is, justice, heroism, or virtue, they are often completely undermined by a world that operates only within the gray morality. No matter how noble their actions are, they are constantly undercut by a reality where nobody gives a fuck about them. The world itself is just entirely indifferent or, even hostile to the ideals that they have. Every righteous deed is met with suspicion or betrayal, and every moral stand becomes a target for exploitation while the characters are perceived as naive idiots. And again, if this were limited, then it's perfect. You get great moments out of it, but the problem is that it is all the time. There is never a chance to breathe. When gray morality is used effectively, it should create tension, not apathy. The most compelling gray characters are good people trapped in bad situations, forced to make impossible choices. They suffer the consequences of those choices, internally and externally, and are constantly grappling with the moral weight of their actions. These characters are interesting because they want to do the right thing, but are pushed into morally compromising positions by a harsh reality. They're not just shitty people doing shitty things. They're flawed heroes or, even sympathetic villains caught in the gears of a morally complex world. A morally gray world is not a complex world. It is a single shade, and that shade sucks. Let's get into gritty realism now, because honestly, this one is probably the worst out of the two. Gray morality, I think people mostly understand, can't be everything. They just use it to terrible effect. But holy fuck, is gritty realism so overused. There's this pervasive mentality that making everything harder, crueler, and more punishing somehow elevates the game into some higher echelon of role-playing. I find that dungeon masters that lean on gritty realism tend to use it as an excuse to micromanage every single detail of a game, constantly reminding the player's characters of their mortality and the world's complete indifference to them. The problem is, players don't come to the table to have every single decision they make scrutinized and bogged down in constant fear of some meaningless, mundane consequence that awaits. I've made the caveat before, but I'll do it again to avoid any misunderstandings. If this is the way you play, this video isn't for you. There is a small niche of players that love this, and that's fine, but the reality is that a majority of the time, it's just a shitty dungeon master exercising their will over the players.
I gave you this. Such a waste. Contemplate this on the tree of woe. Crucify him.
Let's be clear, there is a difference between adding tension to a game through harsher outcomes or realistic recovery times and just being a misery merchant. Gritty realism in the hands of most dungeon masters translates to a game where the entire universe is constantly conspiring against the players at every single turn. Not because it's interesting or dramatic, but because somebody, the dungeon master, decided that suffering equals depth. In reality, suffering for the sake of suffering is the cheapest form of it. At its base, I find that gritty realism is basically just a code word for cynicism and despair, a way for a jaded dungeon master to say that there are no real heroes, there are no real victories, and any that you may obtain is hollow. Advocates of this game style will tell you that happy endings and moments of triumph are unrealistic, but the reality is that they're just dismissive of anything aspirational. They're conflating suffering with realism because they bought into the idea that idealism and heroism are naive. There's nothing wrong with darker stories and struggle, but the overuse of gritty realism leads down a path where everything is pointlessly grim. It's a form of dishonesty, or at the very least, smokescreen for the truth. The dungeon master would be better off actually marketing their campaign as grimdark, but they know that that genre has its own crowd as well who aren't going to put up with the bullshit that they plan on doing. So gritty realism is the subversive smokescreen they can use to attract players that might be interested in a fantasy campaign that's a bit more down to earth and who largely don't have the same boundaries as the more committed niche of grimdark players. The worst aspect of it, in my opinion, is that it often becomes the single excuse bad dungeon masters use to shut down player agency. The realism part is used to deny players the opportunity to make bold decisions. Listen, if you want realism in your game, focus on emotional realism. Characters making meaningful decisions with real consequences. Allow there to be struggles and dark moments, but also let the players breathe. Let them have triumphs that are truly earned and aren't undercut by some arbitrary notion of what gritty means. Players do not need to be endlessly punished by the world. They need to be given a chance to rise above it. So, when you add these two concepts together and they're applied as lazily and cheaply as they tend to be, you ultimately end up with something that stifles creativity and creates a world where literally nothing matters. Gritty realism is the justification for the world constantly punishing the players, while gray morality is the justification for the NPCs constantly punishing the players. Honestly, what I think is missing is heroic virtue. People will go on and on about the depth that you get out of a morally great character, but honestly, that shit is easy to play. It is not difficult to play a character who can justify their selfishness or selflessness depending on the whims of the moment. People do it all the time. I mean, people really live this way. On the opposite hand, it can be incredibly difficult to play a character with strong ideals and convictions, who has to stick to them regardless of the situation that they face, even in the face of death itself. Add that to Tabletop, where a lot of the hobby is built around the style of play that we're all in this together. Playing a character who, in their effort to maintain their ideals, then puts the other player characters at risk, that's tough these days, and it's largely looked down upon. I mean, lawful stupid is a phrase for a reason. Outside of the character aspect, a world that embraces heroic virtues with clear definitions of good and evil offers more satisfying gameplay in my opinion. In a world of absolute good and evil, the stakes are straightforward with a clarity of purpose, instead of wading through the murk of shades of gray where every action is full of ambiguity. Players can generate characters that can confidently pursue goals aligned with their moral compass. To me, this leads to more decisive and impactful actions that drive the campaign forward. You'll get a lot of people that say that actually, gray morality heightens the stakes of a game, but this is untrue when everything is gray. In a black and white moral world, you've got unequivocal evils and absolute good. Both heroism and villainy are enhanced by moral clarity. You also have people that say that a world of absolutes is just too simplistic, that there's not enough nuance for their liking, but this is a clear misunderstanding of what a black and white world should look like. It doesn't have to be simplistic. Characters can still be nuanced within this framework. Heroes can and should struggle to stay true to their ideals in the face of overwhelming odds, and villains can have depth and motivation beyond just simple cruelty. The complexity of black and white worlds lies not in muddying the waters of morality, but in how characters navigate the pressures and consequences of living in a world where the line between good and evil is clearly defined. The choices that they must make are difficult because they have to make them. It's not about whether or not it's right or wrong, but whether or not the characters have the strength to stand by their convictions. The problem I think I run into the most with gray morality when used as ascribed is that the world is full of antiheroes. Even the villains are antiheroes. Everybody just gets lost in this mix of confusion. Clear antagonism creates stronger conflict. Instead of a villain being this ambiguous antihero, they're a true antagonist that are deliberately opposing the forces of good. Villains thrive on the tension and stakes of a black and white moral universe where their actions have direct and undeniable consequence. Every scheme or plot they engage with has weight because every evil act pushes them further into opposition with the forces of good. Speaking of antiheroes, by the way, while villains thrive on the tensions and stakes of a black and white world, antiheroes thrive on the tension between doing what's right and what's necessary. Oftentimes, this is portrayed as making questionable decisions in the service of the greater good, a necessary evil. These types of characters are so much more powerful because their willingness to cross moral lines makes them both indispensable and dangerous. They serve as powerful catalysts for the traditional style heroes, forcing them to confront the reality of tough choices and harsh consequences. You just don't get any of this in a world of absolute gray morality. I guess that's my point, really, that the extreme of anything is going to be bad. A world of absolute good is nice, but there's no tension there for meaningful conflict. A world of absolute evil is the same, just from a different perspective. And a world of gray morality blurs the lines so much that it strips all actions of any consequence or significance. I guess I'm just more focused on the gray morality side of things since it seems so damn popular lately, you just can't get away from it, and I'm tired of the apathy. So let me know how you feel about it. Am I off the mark here? Am I exaggerating just how pervasive this stuff is in the hobby lately? In any case, thank you for watching. I'm Trill, and I hope you enjoyed.